Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back, way back, to a time when the sands of Egypt held secrets under a scorching sun, and life was a bit more organic. Imagine the soft, cool air of a desert night, the distant murmur of the Nile, and the faint scent of incense wafting from a temple. You're there, walking among the mud brick homes, hearing the distant bleating of goats and the laughter of children. It's a world utterly alien to ours, yet powered by the same fundamental human desires. You might think you know ancient Egypt from the pyramids and mummies, but what about the stuff they didn't carve on tomb walls for the afterlife? What about the messy, human, everyday realities of love, lust, and life itself? Honestly, you probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities entirely intact, but that's half the fun, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing now, virtually of course, in the dusty streets of ancient Thebes, feeling the rough texture of linen against your skin, a far cry from your comfy loungewear. When we talk about love and marriage in ancient Egypt, you might imagine grand, romantic gestures, but the reality was often far more practical. It wasn't about finding your soulmate in the Netflix and chill sense. It was about family, stability, and procreation. Marriage was less a sacred vow blessed by deities and more a civil contract, sometimes just an informal agreement. There were no elaborate temple ceremonies for tying the knot, no priests officiating the idos. Instead, a couple might simply move in together, and presto, they were considered married. It sounds a bit like skipping the elaborate wedding planning, doesn't it? Perhaps a relief for those of us who dread seating charts. A man and a woman would often establish a household, with the understanding that they were now bound. The core purpose, from a societal standpoint, was to produce children, particularly sons, to continue the family line and care for the parents in their old age. It was a pragmatic arrangement, but that doesn't mean love was absent. Far from it. We have love poems, written on papyrus and ostraca, that speak of longing, desire, and deep affection between partners. My sister, my beloved, they'd call each other, even if they weren't siblings, a term of endearment that's a bit confusing to our modern ears. My heart yearns for you, one might read, as I long to see your face. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? A quirky tidbit often overlooked is the relatively high status of women in ancient Egypt compared to many other contemporary societies. Women could own property, inherit land, initiate divorces, and even represent themselves in legal matters. This might seem surprising given some of the more restrictive aspects of life we'll discuss later. If a woman brought property into the marriage, it remained hers, and if the marriage ended, she took it with her. This gave them a level of economic independence that was quite revolutionary for the time. Imagine a prenuptial agreement carved in stone. Okay, not stone, but you get the idea. However, despite these progressive aspects, the focus remained heavily on the family unit and the continuation of the lineage. Historians still argue whether these seemingly egalitarian rights truly translated into everyday lived experience for the majority of women, or if they were largely theoretical, applicable primarily to the elite. Was it truly a golden age for women's rights, or merely a slightly less restrictive one? Either way, you wouldn't be seeing any suffragette marches down the Nile, but they certainly had more leverage than, say, their Roman counterparts. Divorce, while possible, carried social implications, and the reasons often revolved around a lack of children, particularly male heirs. After all, a family without a future generation was a bit like a pyramid without a capstone, incomplete. So, you've got this picture of a newly formed household, perhaps a simple mud brick dwelling, with the hum of daily life settling in. The next logical step, and arguably the most crucial from an ancient Egyptian perspective, was the arrival of children. This brings us squarely into the realm of fertility rituals and beliefs, which were deeply ingrained in their understanding of the world. For the Egyptians, fertility wasn't just about human reproduction. It was a cosmic principle, visible in the overflowing Nile, the abundant harvest, and the very cycle of life and death. If the Nile didn't rise, famine ensued. If a woman didn't conceive, her lineage, and indeed her husband's, could end. Talk about pressure. You'd find them engaging in a surprising array of practices to encourage conception. Many rituals involved amulets and charms. A common one was the ankh, the symbol of life, often worn or carried. Others were more specific, like figurines of the hippopotamus goddess Tarit, a fierce protector of pregnant women in childbirth, or the dwarf god Bes, who was depicted with a rather, shall we say, enthusiastic phallus, often associated with pleasure and fertility. Imagine a tiny, squat god with a mischievous grin. His presence in your home meant to bring good vibes and, well, babies. It's a far cry from modern baby showers, isn't it? Though, I suppose the desire for offspring remains just as strong. Another fascinating, if slightly odd, practice involved magical spells and potions. You might find texts describing women drinking a concoction of various herbs, perhaps even a bit of animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? They weren't shy about using what was available. These weren't just folklore. They were a form of ancient medicine, attempts to influence the body's mysterious workings. One particularly quirky tidbit is the use of beer in some fertility rites. Not just for unwinding after a long day of pyramid building, but often mixed with other ingredients and consumed with the explicit intent of aiding conception. Perhaps a relaxed state was considered conducive, or maybe it was just a happy coincidence. Temples also played a role. Women, desperate for a child, might make offerings to specific deities associated with fertility, like Isis, the quintessential mother goddess, or Min, another god often depicted with an erect phallus, symbolizing male virility and generative power. Picture a woman, perhaps with her husband, kneeling before an altar, offering a small statuette or a prayer, her hopes and dreams focused entirely on the gift of new life. It was a deeply spiritual and often public aspect of their lives. However, despite all these efforts, some couples remained childless. This led to adoption, which was a recognized and accepted practice. If a couple couldn't have their own, they might adopt a relative's child or even a child from outside the family, ensuring the continuation of the household and lineage. This shows a pragmatic and compassionate side to their societal structure, where the continuity of the family superseded strict biological ties. Historians still argue whether the focus on male heirs was purely practical for economic and familial succession, or if there was a deeper, almost mystical belief that male lineage was somehow more pure or vital for the family's journey into the afterlife. Was it just about property, or about the very essence of existence? Either way, the pressure to produce offspring, especially sons, was undeniably immense, shaping many of the choices and challenges faced by ancient Egyptian couples. It certainly sounds like a more intense version of "When are you going to give us grandchildren?" from your well-meaning aunt. With the immense societal pressure to procreate and a less than perfect understanding of reproductive biology, it's perhaps unsurprising that ancient Egyptians also explored methods to avoid conception. This brings us to the rather fascinating, and sometimes frankly baffling, topic of contraception, ancient methods. Forget your modern-day pills and patches. These were truly rudimentary, often experimental, and occasionally quite unsettling approaches to family planning. You'd find a mix of folk remedies, magical thinking, and surprisingly, a glimmer of empirical observation. One of the most widely documented, and perhaps most infamous, methods involve concoctions inserted vaginally. We're talking about a rather potent, and frankly, somewhat alarming, mixture: crocodile dung, natron, and honey. Yes, you heard that right, crocodile dung. The theory, if you can call it that, was that the dung would create an acidic environment, acting as a spermicide, while the honey might have acted as a sticky barrier or adhesive, though its actual efficacy is highly debatable. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern doctor. So, about my birth control. It certainly puts a new spin on natural remedies, doesn't it? This particular recipe is even mentioned in the Kahin Gynecological Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts, so it wasn't just some back-alley folk remedy. It had a certain level of, shall we say, medical endorsement for its time. Beyond the rather pungent options, other proposed methods involved more palatable, though likely equally ineffective, ingredients. For instance, some texts suggest using acacia gum, often mixed with honey and dates. Acacia gum, when fermented, produces lactic acid, which is a known spermicidal agent. So, while they probably didn't understand the chemistry, there might have been a serendipitous effectiveness to this particular combination, perhaps more so than the crocodile dung, thankfully. You can almost picture an ancient Egyptian woman meticulously preparing her remedy, hoping against hope that it would work. Another quirky tidbit, though less about physical barriers or spermicides, relates to amulets and magical spells intended to ward off pregnancy. Just as they used charms for fertility, they also used them to prevent it. A woman might wear a specific amulet or recite an incantation, believing that magical protection would prevent conception. This highlights the pervasive belief in the supernatural influencing every aspect of life, including the most intimate. It's a bit like wishing upon a star for no baby, but with more steps and significantly more crocodile byproducts. Physical barriers were also theoretically known, though perhaps less common or effective. Ancient texts hint at the use of linen sheaths or plugs, possibly soaked in certain substances. These would have been crude and uncomfortable, a far cry from modern condoms. Historians still argue whether these were primarily for contraception or perhaps more for protection against sexually transmitted infections, which we'll touch upon later. The archaeological record for such perishable items is, understandably, very scarce, leaving much to scholarly debate and educated guesswork. Was it a conscious effort at family planning, or just a desperate measure? Either way, it shows a clear desire to control reproduction, even with the limited knowledge and tools available. It truly makes you appreciate the marvels of modern medicine, doesn't it? Just imagine the conversations. Honey, did you remember to fetch the dung for tonight? Having touched upon the efforts to prevent conception, we now turn to the inevitable reality for many ancient Egyptian women: childbirth. This was, without exaggeration, one of the most perilous experiences a woman could face in the ancient world. Forget your epidurals, sterile environments, and a team of medical professionals. You're entering a world where childbirth was a battle fought on the floor of a humble home, with only traditional knowledge and perhaps the guidance of local midwives. The risks were astronomical, and survival was far from guaranteed for both mother and child. Imagine yourself, an expectant mother, nearing full term. Your days are filled with increasing discomfort, and a sense of dread might mingle with the anticipation. The lack of proper sanitation, understanding of germ theory, and surgical intervention meant that complications, from infections to hemorrhages, were often fatal. It's a stark reminder of how fragile life was, and how deeply personal this experience must have been. When labor began, you wouldn't be rushed to a hospital. Instead, birth would typically take place at home, often in a semi-squatting or kneeling position, sometimes with the aid of birthing bricks. These were special bricks, often adorned with images of deities like Taret or Bes, providing support and perhaps a spiritual safeguard. Picture two bricks, perhaps adorned with reassuring images, placed on either side of the birthing woman, allowing her to lean and push. It's a simple piece of technology, yet crucial for support in a time without elevated birthing beds. The birthing process itself was often assisted by other women, family members, neighbors, and most importantly, the local midwife. These women were not formally trained physicians in the modern sense, but possessed invaluable practical knowledge passed down through generations. They understood the rhythm of labor, how to offer comfort, and when to invoke specific prayers or rituals. They might have used various herbal remedies to ease pain or hasten delivery, though many of these were likely more placebo than potent. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Kahan Papyrus, which we briefly mentioned earlier, contains surprisingly detailed instructions for diagnosing pregnancy and predicting birth outcomes, suggesting a degree of systematic knowledge for the time. A quirky tidbit that might make you wince is the use of fumes and smoke in some birthing rituals. It was believed that inhaling certain vapors, perhaps from burning herbs, could either alleviate pain or help speed up contractions. While potentially dangerous, it speaks to a desperate attempt to manage the agony of labor. You might also find references to specific birth chairs or stools in some depictions, although these were probably less common than the birthing bricks for the general populace. Despite all efforts, infant mortality rates were incredibly high. Many children would not survive their first year of life due to disease, infection, or complications from birth. This grim reality shaped the emotional landscape of families, where joy at a new arrival was often tempered by a quiet understanding of the fragility of that new life. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism in some ancient Egyptian texts regarding child mortality reflects a genuine lack of emotional attachment or simply a societal coping mechanism for inevitable loss. Was it a pragmatic acceptance, or did they grieve as deeply as we do, just in a different way? The truth is probably somewhere in between. It certainly wasn't a time for elaborate gender reveal parties, but rather quiet hopes for survival. So, you've survived the perilous journey of childbirth, and now you hold a tiny, vulnerable new life in your arms. This brings us directly to infant care and childhood in ancient Egypt, a period marked by both immense challenges and a deep societal value placed on children, despite the ever-present threat of disease and early death. The concept of "it takes a village" was profoundly true, as communities banded together to raise the next generation. From the moment of birth, the focus was on survival. Given the high infant mortality rates we just discussed, the first few years of a child's life were a constant tightrope walk. You wouldn't find perfectly sanitized nurseries or baby monitors. Instead, infants were typically breastfed, often for an extended period, sometimes up to 2 or 3 years. This wasn't just about nutrition, it provided crucial antibodies in a world teeming with pathogens. Imagine a bustling household, with mothers or wet nurses constantly attending to their little ones, the sound of cooing and occasional cries filling the air. A mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian art and texts depict children in a surprisingly realistic and affectionate manner. You'll see images of parents holding their children, playing with them, and showing genuine tenderness. This contrasts with some other ancient cultures where children were rarely depicted with such individualized warmth. For example, tomb paintings often show family units, with children at their parents' knees, participating in daily life, suggesting they were truly integrated into the family and not merely seen as future labor or heirs. For the youngest infants, a rather quirky tidbit involves various protective measures against evil spirits or illnesses. Beyond the practical care, there was a strong belief in the power of magic and divine intervention. Amulets were frequently placed around an infant's neck or wrist, often depicting deities like Bes or Taret, believed to ward off harm. You might even see remnants of practices like protective spells being recited over a child, or special oils being applied. It's a blend of practical care and superstitious belief, all aimed at ensuring the child's survival in a hostile world. Imagine slathering your baby in something that smells vaguely of myrrh and hope, all to keep the bad juju away. As children grew, their upbringing diverged significantly based on their gender and social class. Boys from elite families might attend a school attached to a temple or the palace, learning to read, write, and become scribes or administrators. For most boys, however, childhood transitioned quickly into apprenticeship, learning their father's trade, whether farming, craftsmanship, or something else. Girls, regardless of class, were primarily trained in domestic skills, cooking, weaving, managing a household. There were exceptions, of course, as some elite women were educated, but generally, their role was within the home. Play was an important part of childhood, just as it is today. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed various toys, spinning tops, dolls made of wood or cloth, and even miniature animal figures. You can picture children running through the dusty streets, playing games remarkably similar to those of children today, perhaps chasing each other or pretending to be priests or pharaohs. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rate for children led to a different form of parental attachment, one perhaps more emotionally guarded, or if the deep love for children outweighed the constant threat of loss. Was every new birth celebrated with unbridled joy, or with a quiet, hopeful trepidation? It's a difficult question to answer from a distance of thousands of years, but the evidence of affection in art suggests that the bonds were undoubtedly strong, even in the face of such pervasive tragedy. The sheer resilience required to raise a family in ancient Egypt is truly astounding. So, a family has been established, perhaps with a few resilient children thriving against the odds. But what happens when the bonds of that pragmatic ancient Egyptian marriage are, shall we say, strained? This leads us to the topic of adultery, societal consequences, a breach of the marital contract that carried significant weight, particularly for women. While ancient Egypt granted women more rights than many contemporary societies, their agency within the marital sphere had very definite limits when it came to infidelity. Imagine a world where community reputation is everything and where lineage is paramount. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a societal disruption. For a man, the consequences of infidelity were often far less severe, reflecting a patriarchal bias, though not as extreme as in some other cultures. If a man engaged in extramarital affairs, it might be viewed with a certain degree of tolerance, especially if it didn't threaten the legitimate lineage of his primary wife. It was generally considered a private matter, perhaps a sign of poor judgment or a lack of self-control, but rarely a crime punishable by severe means. A bit like a wink and a shrug, compared to the thunder and lightning that might fall upon his female counterpart. However, for a woman, the situation was dramatically different. Her fidelity was directly linked to the legitimacy of her children and the purity of the family line. If a woman committed adultery, it was seen as a grave offense, not just against her husband, but against the entire social order. A mainstream historical fact is that the penalties for female adultery could be severe, ranging from public shaming and divorce to more extreme punishments, though the exact nature and frequency of these varied over time and depended on social standing. Texts like the Instruction of Tahotep warn men to avoid affairs with married women, not just because it's morally wrong, but because it brings immense trouble upon them. A particularly quirky tidbit revolves around specific legal provisions found in some contracts. For instance, some marriage agreements explicitly stipulated a financial penalty for the husband if he divorced his wife due to her infidelity, meaning he might still have to provide for her, albeit often a reduced amount. This suggests a nuanced approach, where even in cases of female transgression, there was an attempt to maintain a degree of order and prevent outright destitution. It wasn't always a simple throw her out on the street scenario. However, the social stigma would have been immense, and her standing within the community severely damaged. While explicit capital punishment for adultery is not as widely documented or consistently applied as in some other cultures, the threat was certainly present in the legal imagination. Some legal texts hint at the possibility of a woman being thrown into the water or subjected to other harsh retributions, particularly in cases where the adultery was deemed to have brought exceptional dishonor to the family. However, historians still argue whether these were actual common punishments or rhetorical flourishes used in legal texts to deter transgression. Was the ultimate penalty a swift execution or a social death that was arguably worse? The consensus leans towards social ostracism and divorce being the more common outcomes, but the fear of harsher penalties undoubtedly lingered. Ultimately, while men had more leeway, both genders faced consequences for illicit affairs, albeit disproportionately. The sanctity of the legitimate household and the continuation of the family line were paramount in ancient Egyptian society. A broken marital bond due to infidelity was a disruption to that vital order, and while forgiveness might have been possible in some private instances, publicly, the fallout for a woman was far more devastating than for a man. It paints a picture of a society that, despite its advancements in other areas, clung tightly to traditional gender roles within the framework of family honor. Given the strictures surrounding adultery, especially for women, you might logically wonder about the existence of prostitution, a hidden world in ancient Egypt. Was there an acknowledged or tolerated profession catering to sexual needs outside of marriage? The answer, like much about the private lives of Egyptians, is murky, lacking the overt documentation you might find in, say, ancient Greece or Rome. Unlike those cultures, where courtesans and brothels are relatively well attested, direct evidence for widespread, organized prostitution in ancient Egypt is remarkably scarce, leading to considerable scholarly debate. This absence of explicit evidence doesn't necessarily mean it didn't exist. It's more likely that if it did, it wasn't openly acknowledged or recorded in the formal, public texts we rely on. Ancient Egyptian society was highly stratified and obsessed with order and appearances. Activities deemed disreputable would simply not be immortalized on temple walls or in official papyri. Imagine trying to find evidence of a hidden speakeasy from a government census. It just wouldn't be there. However, a mainstream historical fact is that there is some indirect evidence and scholarly interpretation that suggests the presence of women who might have engaged in sex work. This evidence often comes from love poems and songs that speak of loose women or singing girls who frequented taverns and festivals. These individuals might not have been full-time prostitutes in the modern sense, but their roles likely included entertaining men and perhaps offering sexual favors for payment or gifts. Think of a festive atmosphere, perhaps fueled by beer, where inhibitions are lowered and opportunities arise. A particularly quirky tidbit comes from archaeological finds at workers' villages, like Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs. Graffiti and ostraca, pottery shards used for writing, found there sometimes depict women in provocative poses or mention encounters that could be interpreted as transactional. It's a bit like finding suggestive doodles in a modern construction site's break room. Not official documentation, but certainly hints at certain activities. These pin-ups of their time might suggest a demand for sexual entertainment that was met, even if informally. Another line of argument considers the concept of sacred prostitution or temple prostitution, which was present in some ancient Near Eastern cultures. However, there's very little solid evidence to support its widespread practice in Egypt. While cults of fertility goddesses existed, their rituals generally focused on symbolic acts of procreation and abundance, not on literal sexual services provided by priestesses. Historians still argue whether the occasional references to holy women or sacred dancers in some religious contexts imply a sexual component or if they were purely ceremonial. Was it a form of religious devotion or simply a misinterpretation of ancient texts? The prevailing view is that it was largely absent in the form seen elsewhere. Ultimately, if prostitution existed, it was likely an underground phenomenon, perhaps a part-time activity for women struggling economically, or informal arrangements in taverns and less reputable parts of towns. It wouldn't have been a respected profession, and certainly not one openly discussed or depicted. So, while we can't definitively say, yes, there were brothels on every corner, we can infer that human nature being what it is, some form of transactional sex likely occurred, just hidden from the gaze of the official records and the moralizing elite. It's like trying to find an illicit poker game by looking at the official bank records. You just won't see it. Moving from the shadowy corners of potential sex work, we delve into another aspect of ancient Egyptian sexuality that remains largely speculative due to a scarcity of direct evidence. Homosexuality, murky waters. Unlike many other facets of their lives, which are extensively documented in tombs, temples, and papyri, explicit references to same-sex relationships are rare and often open to multiple interpretations. This silence, or ambiguity, is itself a significant part of the story. You see, the ancient Egyptians didn't categorize sexual orientation in the same way modern Western societies do. The concept of homosexuality as an identity simply didn't exist in their framework. Instead, their concerns revolved more around social roles, dominance, and the act of procreation. This makes it incredibly difficult to apply our contemporary labels to their behaviors. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a hieroglyphic hole. It just doesn't quite work. A mainstream historical fact often cited in this debate is the case of Khnumhotep and Nyankhnum, two male officials from the 5th dynasty, whose shared tomb at Saqqara depicts them in intimate poses. They are shown embracing, touching noses, a common Egyptian gesture of affection, and their titles suggest they were overseers of the manicurists of the Great House. The most striking image shows them nose-to-nose, almost kissing, in a way that typically portrays a married couple. This has led many scholars to interpret their relationship as a probable same-sex partnership, perhaps even a marriage. Imagine stumbling upon a tomb depicting two men in such affectionate proximity, and trying to decipher the true nature of their bond after millennia. However, a quirky tidbit and an alternative interpretation suggest that these depictions could simply represent a very close fraternal bond, or perhaps a symbolic joining for the afterlife, rather than an explicit romantic or sexual one. Some scholars argue that the poses are ambiguous enough to be interpreted as exceptionally close friends or even twins, emphasizing their spiritual unity. This highlights the challenge of interpreting ancient visual language through a modern lens. What seems obvious to us might have had a different cultural meaning then. It's a bit like trying to understand sarcasm from a silent film. The lack of negative condemnation of same-sex acts in most Egyptian texts is also noteworthy. While there are some texts, like the contendings of Horus and Seth, which describe the god Seth attempting to sexually assault Horus, this act is portrayed as an attempt at domination and humiliation, not necessarily condemned for its same-sex nature. Horus's clever evasion and subsequent impregnation of Seth, don't ask, it's ancient mythology, things get weird, turns the tables and shames Seth, implying the shame lies in being the passive partner or being dominated, rather than the gender of the participants. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of evidence for homosexuality indicates its rarity, or simply that it was not deemed worthy of public record, either because it was accepted as a private matter or because it was actively suppressed from official discourse. Was it a non-issue or an unmentionable? The truth likely lies somewhere in the realm of, it probably happened, but nobody was writing epic poems about it or carving it on temple walls. The focus of Egyptian society was so heavily skewed towards procreation and the continuity of the family line that non-procreative sexual acts were simply outside the primary narrative, regardless of gender. It's a testament to the idea that some aspects of human behavior simply fly under the radar of grand historical narratives. From the intricacies of relationship dynamics, we glide into the more tangible realm of attraction and self-presentation in ancient Egypt. This brings us to clothing, perfumes, and allure, elements that were crucial not just for hygiene and protection, but also for enhancing beauty, signifying status, and, yes, attracting a mate. Forget your fast fashion and celebrity endorsements. In ancient Egypt, looking good was a meticulous and often ritualistic affair. Imagine yourself draped in the finest linen, the ubiquitous fabric of the Nile Valley. It was light, breathable, and perfectly suited for the hot climate. Both men and women wore simple, elegant garments. For men, it was often a kilt or a tunic, sometimes intricately pleated. For women, a tight-fitting sheath dress, often reaching to the ankles with shoulder straps. While seemingly simple, the quality of the linen, the fineness of the pleating, and the transparency could all denote wealth and status. A sheer, almost translucent linen dress would have been quite alluring, hinting at the form beneath without revealing too much. It's a sophisticated kind of tease, isn't it? But clothing was just the beginning. The Egyptians were masters of cosmetics. This wasn't merely about vanity. It had practical and even religious significance. Both men and women liberally applied kohl around their eyes. This iconic black eyeliner, made from galena, wasn't just for dramatic effect. It also served as a protection against the glare of the sun and was believed to ward off eye infections, a very real threat in a dusty environment. Imagine trying to explain to your modern makeup artist that your eyeliner doubles as a health preventative. And the green eyeshadow, made from malachite, wasn't just a fashion statement. It was thought to have protective properties as well. A mainstream historical fact is that personal hygiene was incredibly important. Egyptians were meticulous about cleanliness, regularly bathing in the Nile or using basins in their homes. They used natron as a sort of soap substitute and created early forms of toothpaste from powdered rock salt, mint, and iris flowers. Imagine the daily ritual of cleansing and adorning, not just for a special occasion, but as a fundamental part of existing in their world. Now, for the allure, let's talk about perfumes and oils. The Egyptians loved fragrance. They used scented oils and unguents made from myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and other aromatic plants. These weren't applied sparingly. You might find cones of solid perfumed fat worn on the head, slowly melting and releasing their scent throughout the day. It's a quirky tidbit that must have created an entirely different olfactory experience from anything we know. Imagine attending a feast and being enveloped in a cloud of slowly melting, sweet-smelling fat, perhaps a bit sticky, but certainly memorable. These perfumes were not only for personal scent, but also for religious ceremonies and funerary rites, blurring the lines between the sacred and the sensual. Hair was also a significant aspect of allure. While some Egyptians, particularly priests, might shave their heads, many wore their hair long or in elaborate wigs, often adorned with braids, beads, and even gold ornaments. The wigs, made from human hair or plant fibers, were not just fashionable. They also provided a clean, pest-free alternative to natural hair. Historians still argue whether the elaborate cosmetic practices and emphasis on physical beauty were purely for aesthetic and social reasons, or if they had a deeper, spiritual significance, connecting the adorned body to concepts of divine perfection and regeneration in the afterlife. Was it simply about looking good, or about embodying an ideal? Either way, the meticulous attention to grooming and adornment paints a picture of a society that truly understood the power of presentation and the subtle art of attraction long before the advent of beauty influencers. Now that we've admired the meticulous grooming and alluring aesthetics of the ancient Egyptians, let's peel back another layer of their daily reality: the ever-present threat of diseases and treatments, including those that might have been transmitted through intimate contact. In a world without modern antibiotics, vaccines, or even a basic understanding of germ theory, illness was a constant companion, shaping life expectancy and quality of life in profound ways. You're stepping into a medical landscape that relied heavily on observation, experience, and a hefty dose of magical thinking. Imagine a time when a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection, or a common cold could escalate into a deadly pneumonia. Life was precarious, and the Egyptians, despite their advanced civilization in many respects, faced constant battles against pathogens. A mainstream historical fact is that their medical papyri, like the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, demonstrate a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of anatomy, surgery, and diagnosis for their time. They could set broken bones, treat wounds, and even perform rudimentary surgeries. This shows a pragmatic approach to healing, even if their underlying understanding of disease causation was fundamentally flawed. However, when it came to venereal diseases, the historical record becomes, once again, a bit hazy. Direct, unequivocal evidence for diseases like syphilis or gonorrhea in ancient Egypt is scarce. This doesn't mean they didn't exist, but rather that the symptoms might have been attributed to other causes or simply not recorded with enough specificity for modern diagnosis. For example, symptoms like skin lesions, genital sores, or painful urination could be caused by various conditions, and without DNA analysis of mummified remains, it's hard to be certain. A quirky tidbit is the mention of certain pustules or ulcers in some medical texts, sometimes treated with rather bizarre remedies. For instance, there are recipes for salves and poultices made from ingredients like various plant extracts, honey, a known antiseptic, and even animal fats, applied to treat skin conditions or sores. While these might have offered some symptomatic relief, they certainly weren't curing underlying bacterial or viral infections. Imagine visiting your ancient Egyptian doctor, describing your uncomfortable symptoms, and being handed a jar of something suspiciously resembling fermented bat droppings and honey. Okay, maybe not bats, but certainly other animal byproducts. Beyond specific venereal infections, the general health of the population was often compromised by parasitic diseases from the Nile, like schistosomiasis, eye infections from the dusty environment, and dental issues from gritty bread. These common ailments would have weakened the immune system, making individuals more susceptible to other infections, including those that might be sexually transmitted. Historians still argue whether the lack of clear diagnostic categories for venereal diseases in ancient texts means they were rare, or simply that the Egyptians didn't distinguish them from other skin conditions or bodily discomforts. Was the population healthier in that regard, or were these diseases just part of the background noise of frequent illness? The prevailing view is that while modern STIs might not have been prevalent in the forms we recognize, other forms of genitourinary infections undoubtedly existed and were treated with the limited means available. The delicate balance between magic, empiricism, and sheer desperation defined their medical approach, a stark contrast to the targeted precision of modern medicine. You certainly wouldn't want to get sick in ancient Egypt, especially with something that might require a trip to this specialist. Having explored the often uncomfortable realities of health and disease, let's pivot to a concept that permeated every aspect of ancient Egyptian life, including their understanding of reproduction and human intimacy, death, and the afterlife connection. For the Egyptians, life on Earth was but a fleeting prelude to an eternal existence, and this profound belief profoundly influenced their attitudes towards fertility, family, and even the very nature of sex. You're now stepping into a worldview where every act, every birth, and every relationship had echoes in the realm of the eternal. Imagine a society where your final destination, the field of reeds, was as real, if not more real, than the dusty path outside your door. This intense focus on the afterlife meant that continuity, both personal and familial, was paramount. To be remembered, to have your name spoken, and to have offerings brought to your tomb were essential for your eternal well-being. And what was the most fundamental way to ensure this continuity? Children, of course. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary purpose of marriage and procreation in ancient Egypt was not merely earthly pleasure or companionship, but the solemn duty of producing heirs who would maintain the funerary cult. Your children, particularly your eldest son, were responsible for performing rituals, making offerings, and ensuring your sustenance in the afterlife. Without descendants, your journey through the underworld could be perilous, and your very existence in eternity threatened. It's a bit like having an eternal subscription service, and your kids are responsible for paying the monthly fees. Talk about parental pressure. This deep connection between family and the afterlife meant that infertility was not just a personal sorrow, but a spiritual crisis. A couple unable to conceive might feel that their very immortal souls were at risk. This heightened the desire for fertility and explains the myriad of rituals and remedies we discussed earlier. Every successful birth was not just a joyous event. It was a cosmic victory, ensuring the perpetuation of the family's presence both on Earth and in the hereafter. A quirky tidbit that beautifully illustrates this connection is the concept of Ka and Ba souls. Your Ka was your life force, needing sustenance, and your Ba was your personality, able to travel between the living and the dead. Both depended on the memory and offerings of the living. So, when an Egyptian engaged in sexual activity, there was an implicit understanding that it wasn't just about pleasure, it was about ensuring the survival of souls, about providing the very foundation for eternal existence. Imagine the added gravitas to every romantic encounter, knowing it literally paved the way for immortality. The funerary texts, such as the Book of the Dead, are filled with spells and incantations to guide the deceased through the challenges of the underworld. But even these sacred texts implicitly rely on the idea of a family who would perform the necessary rites. The emphasis on filial piety and the duty to one's parents extended beyond their mortal life into the vastness of eternity. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' apparent embrace of life and sensual pleasures was a contradiction to their intense focus on death, or if the two were intrinsically linked. Was the pursuit of earthly delights merely a preparation for the joys of the afterlife? Or was life to be lived fully because it was so fleeting before the eternal journey? The most compelling argument suggests that for the Egyptians, life, death, and regeneration formed a seamless cycle, much like the annual inundation of the Nile. Birth led to life, life to death, and death, through proper rituals and the continuation of the family line, led to rebirth in the glorious afterlife. It's a holistic view where intimacy wasn't just about the physical, but about the very fabric of existence, stretching far beyond the confines of a single lifetime. Having explored the profound connection between life, death, and procreation, let's now turn our gaze to how these intimate aspects of human existence, including desire and fertility, were actually expressed visually and narratively. This brings us to art and erotic depictions in ancient Egypt, a realm where sensuality, while often symbolic, was undeniably present, though rarely in the explicit, almost pornographic, forms you might associate with some other ancient cultures. You're about to discover a world where subtlety and symbolism often conveyed more than overt display. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace, or perhaps a noble's tomb, and encountering art that speaks to the very essence of life's pleasures. While you won't find explicit sexual acts plastered on public monuments, the Egyptians certainly weren't prudish about the human form or the celebration of fertility. Much of what might be termed erotic in Egyptian art is embedded in a broader context of life, regeneration, and the natural world. A mainstream historical fact is that scenes of intimate human interaction, particularly in tombs, were often symbolic representations of rebirth and the continuation of life. For instance, Depictions of couples embracing or holding hands were not just portrayals of earthly affection. They were potent symbols of the desire for eternal companionship and procreation in the afterlife. The ideal image of a happily married couple, often with children at their feet, was a wish for enduring bliss in the next world. It's a bit like a highly stylized, eternal family portrait. However, a quirky tidbit reveals that not all depictions were purely symbolic or overtly wholesome. We do find some evidence of more explicit, or at least highly suggestive, imagery, particularly on ostraca, pottery shards, or limestone flakes used for sketches and informal notes, found in workers' villages like Deir el-Medina. These often show caricatures, humorous scenes, or even frankly erotic drawings, sometimes depicting exaggerated sexual organs or explicit acts between humans and even animals, don't ask. These were essentially the ancient world's equivalent of bathroom stall graffiti or humorous sketches, offering a glimpse into the more earthy, less official side of Egyptian life and humor. Imagine finding a cartoon drawing of a pharaoh with exaggerated features on a discarded piece of pottery. It humanizes them in a way the grand monuments never would. Moreover, certain gods were routinely depicted with prominent phalluses, most notably Min, the god of fertility and regeneration. These weren't meant to be titillating, but rather powerful visual symbols of creative force, abundance, and the continuity of life. His erect penis was a symbol of his power to bring forth life, much like the fertile floodwaters of the Nile. Then there's the rich body of love poetry. While not visual art, these papyri, often found in private contexts, are masterpieces of sensual and romantic expression. They speak of longing, desire, the beauty of the beloved's body, and the yearning for intimacy. My beloved's voice is a fragrant breeze, one might read. Her lips are petals of a flower. These poems, though not explicitly erotic in a graphic sense, are deeply sensual and convey a powerful sense of passion and desire. They paint a vibrant picture of private emotions that the formal art often only hinted at. Historians still argue whether the seemingly subtle nature of much Egyptian erotic art reflects a genuinely restrained attitude towards public displays of sexuality, or if it's simply that much of the explicit material was either perishable, like drawings on papyrus that didn't survive, or confined to private, non-funerary contexts that haven't been discovered. Was their art truly demure by nature, or are we simply missing vast quantities of more graphic material? The truth is likely a blend. A society that understood the power of the suggestive, coupled with a preference for symbolism in their monumental works, leaving the more overt expressions to private, informal moments. Having explored the human and artistic expressions of sexuality, it's time to ascend to the divine realm and examine divine sexuality and mythology in ancient Egypt. For a people whose worldview was deeply entwined with their gods, it's no surprise that the very act of creation, reproduction, and even sexual escapades found their echoes in the myths and legends surrounding their pantheon. You're about to witness a cosmic drama where gods and goddesses, much like humans, engage in acts of passion, procreation, and sometimes divine mischief. Imagine a universe born from an act of cosmic self-pleasure. This isn't a modern fantasy. It's central to the Egyptian creation myth. A mainstream historical fact is that the god Adam, the primeval creator god of the Heliopolitan cosmology, was said to have brought the first deities, Shu and Tefnut, into existence through an act of masturbation. Picture the chaotic waters of Nun, and then Adam, alone, generating life from his own essence. This was not considered shameful or taboo, but rather a powerful, self-sufficient act of creation, establishing a fundamental link between divine sexuality and the very fabric of existence. It sets a rather high bar for self-reliance, doesn't it? The gods and goddesses were rarely depicted as celibate. They formed divine families, engaged in marital relations, and produced offspring, mirroring the human societal structure, but on a grander, more powerful scale. Osiris and Isis, for example, were the quintessential divine couple, their love story and the birth of their son, Horus, being central to the Egyptian understanding of kingship, death, and resurrection. Their union, even after Osiris's murder and dismemberment, was essential for the continuation of life and order, Ma'at. A particularly quirky tidbit comes from the myth of Seth and Horus, which we briefly touched on earlier. In their struggle for dominance, Seth attempts to sexually assault Horus as an act of humiliation and subjugation. However, Horus, advised by his mother Isis, catches Seth's semen in his hands and disposes of it in the Nile. Later, Isis collects Horus's semen and cunningly smears it onto lettuce, which Seth then unknowingly eats. When the gods try to determine who is superior, Horus calls forth his semen from Seth's body, proving his virility and Seth's unwitting subjugation. It's a bizarre, almost comical tale, highlighting not just power dynamics, but also the ancient Egyptian fascination with bodily fluids and their transformative power. Imagine the look on Seth's face when he realized that particular snack. Many deities were directly associated with fertility and childbirth. Hathor, the cow goddess, was a multifaceted deity associated with love, joy, music, and motherhood, often depicted as a nurturing figure. Taret, the hippopotamus goddess, continued her role as a protector during pregnancy and birth, even in the divine realm. The pharaoh himself was often considered to be the divine offspring of a god and a human queen, lending sacred legitimacy to his rule. Historians still argue whether the anthropomorphic portrayal of divine sexuality, complete with its passions and sometimes outlandish acts, was a literal belief for the masses or a sophisticated mythological framework designed to explain cosmic forces and human experiences in relatable terms. Was it a story for children or a profound theological concept? It was likely both, serving as a complex tapestry that explained the mysteries of creation, life, and the enduring power of procreation, all while allowing for a bit of dramatic flair. The gods, it seems, were very much like humans, just with bigger powers and far more dramatic family squabbles. From the cosmic unions of the gods, we descend back to Earth, to the lifeblood of ancient Egypt itself, the Nile. This brings us to the Nile's fertility role, a concept so pervasive and fundamental that it wasn't just a river. It was a deity, a life-giver, and the ultimate symbol of fertility and regeneration. For the Egyptians, the annual inundation of the Nile was the most profound and consistent example of rebirth, and it colored their entire understanding of fertility, human sexuality, and the cyclical nature of existence. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile in late summer, watching as the waters swell, slowly creeping over the parched land, depositing rich, black silt. This wasn't just an agricultural event. It was a miraculous transformation, turning barren ground into fertile soil, ready to burst forth with life. This annual flooding, the inundation or Ake, was absolutely critical for their survival and agricultural prosperity. Without it, there was famine. With it, abundance. A mainstream historical fact is that the Nile's predictable annual flood was seen as a direct act of the gods, particularly Hapi, the god of the inundation, who was often depicted with a swollen belly, symbolizing abundance. This divine act of renewal wasn't just about growing crops. It was a metaphor for all forms of fertility, including human reproduction. The life-giving waters brought forth sustenance, just as the union of a man and woman brought forth new life. The connection was explicit and deeply felt. The very landscape of Egypt, a narrow ribbon of green life nestled between vast, sterile deserts, reinforced this idea. The fertile black land, Kemet, was a gift from the Nile, contrasting sharply with the red land, Desheret, of the desert. This duality mirrored life and death, fertility and barrenness. You lived in the black land, you were buried in the red land. But even in death, the hope of regeneration, like the Nile's return, persisted. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this profound connection is the use of the Ankh symbol. While we've seen it as a general symbol of life, its form, resembling a looped cross, is sometimes interpreted as a stylized representation of the male and female reproductive organs joined together, or even a representation of the Nile's key and floodgates, unlocking life. While this is a scholarly interpretation rather than a direct ancient Egyptian statement, it speaks to the pervasive association of life, water, and human fertility. It's a rather clever piece of symbolic design, if you think about it. Rituals and festivals revolved around the Nile's inundation, celebrating its life-giving power. These weren't just agricultural rites. They were celebrations of cosmic fertility, ensuring the continued abundance of life in all its forms. Offerings might be made to the Nile, prayers recited, all to encourage a good flood and, by extension, good harvests and plentiful births. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' fatalistic acceptance of the Nile's power and their reliance on its cycles fostered a more accepting attitude towards the unpredictability of human reproduction, or if it intensified their desire to control fertility through magic and medicine. Was it a sense of, as the river flows, so flows life? Or did it make them strive even harder for control? The Nile, in its rhythmic cycle of flood and recession, was the ultimate teacher of renewal, demonstrating that even after a dry spell, life would return. This deep-seated belief in regeneration, inspired by the river, undoubtedly informed their views on death as a transition and procreation as a vital link in the chain of eternal existence. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest lessons come from the most consistent natural phenomena, quietly repeating themselves year after year for millennia. So, we've journeyed through the intimate landscapes of ancient Egypt, from the practicalities of marriage to the cosmic dance of divine procreation, all under the watchful eye of the life-giving Nile. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's consider the legacy, echoes in time. How do these ancient attitudes towards sex, love, and life, seemingly so distant and often strange, resonate, however subtly, in our world today? You might be surprised by the threads that still connect us across millennia. Imagine looking at a family portrait from thousands of years ago, etched on a tomb wall, and realizing that the fundamental desires and challenges are strikingly similar. The desire for companionship, the joy of children, the sorrow of loss, the struggle with illness. These are timeless human experiences. While the methods and societal norms have changed drastically, the underlying emotional tapestry remains remarkably consistent. A mainstream historical fact is that the emphasis on family lineage, the continuation of the name, and the care for elders, though expressed through different customs, are values that still hold significant weight in many cultures globally, mirroring the ancient Egyptian dedication to their ancestors and future generations. A quirky tidbit that often goes unnoticed is how ancient Egyptian approaches, however primitive, laid conceptual groundwork for later medical and social practices. Think of their early attempts at contraception and fertility remedies. While the crocodile dung might make you chuckle, the intent was clear: to control reproduction, a desire that drives vast sectors of modern medicine and social policy. Their empirical observations, even if sometimes mixed with magic, represented an early form of scientific inquiry into the human body and its functions. They were experimenting, observing, and drawing conclusions, however flawed, long before the scientific method was formally articulated. It's like discovering that your ancient great-grandparents were proto-chemists, just with slightly smellier ingredients. Moreover, the relatively elevated status of women in ancient Egypt, compared to many of their contemporaries, continues to be a point of fascination and inspiration. While not a feminist utopia by any stretch, their legal rights to property and divorce stand as a testament to a society that afforded women a degree of agency that would not be common in many parts of the world until very recently. Historians still argue whether this was due to practical necessities in a highly structured society, or if it reflected a deeper cultural valuing of women's roles. Was it a pragmatic arrangement, or a philosophical enlightenment? Whatever the reason, it serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a linear progression, and some societies were remarkably progressive in certain areas while remaining conservative in others. The profound intertwining of sex, death, and regeneration in Egyptian thought also offers a valuable lens through which to view our own complex relationship with these fundamental aspects of existence. For them, death was not an end, but a transition, and procreation was the bridge. In our modern world, where death is often feared and hidden, and where reproduction is increasingly medicalized, their holistic view provides a powerful counter-narrative, reminding us of the interconnectedness of all life cycles. As you drift now, away from the dusty streets and bustling markets of ancient Egypt, remember that the echoes of their lives, their loves, and their intimate struggles continue to whisper through time. They remind us of the enduring human spirit, its resilience, and its timeless desires. The faint scent of ancient spices and the murmur of the Nile are fading now, dissolving into the quiet hum of your own room. The stories of love and life, birth and rebirth, woven into the very fabric of ancient Egypt, are settling into the soft corners of your mind. Let the details of crocodile dung and self-creating gods gently recede, replaced by a profound sense of the timeless human journey. Feel the peaceful rhythm of your breath, slowing, deepening. The long passage of history stretches out behind you, a vast and quiet landscape, and you are a tiny, precious part of its ongoing story. There's nothing more to do now, nowhere to be, except here, safe in the gentle cocoon of night. Let the ancient whispers lull you into a deep, restorative sleep. Sweet dreams, traveler. End of script. Sweet dreams.